They didn't just get rich, they made sure the money could never leave. For nearly 100 years, the Rothschilds did something that no other family in modern history pulled off at the same scale. They turned their own bloodline into a financial fortress. Cousins married cousins. Uncles negotiated with nephews over wedding contracts the way other men negotiated over land deals. Fathers sat across from each other at dinner tables that were also, quietly, boardroom tables. And behind every single one of those marriages was the same cold calculation: keep the empire whole. This is not a story about a quirky aristocratic tradition. This is the story of the most sophisticated wealth preservation strategy in the history of capitalism, disguised as a family. But here's the thing that nobody tells you up front. The strategy worked, spectacularly. And the reason it worked will completely change how you think about money, power, and the families that hold both. There is also a secret buried inside this story. A secret that the Rothschild family itself tried to erase from the historical record. Something that happened inside one of these carefully arranged marriages that threatened to bring the entire empire crashing down. That secret will only fully surface in part 3. By the time you get there, you will understand why this family is still talked about 2 centuries later. But first, you need to understand where they came from. Because the Rothschilds did not start powerful. They started in a ghetto. Frankfurt, Germany, 1744. A narrow, overcrowded lane called the Judengasse, which translates without any attempt at poetry as Jew's Alley. This was a street roughly 300 meters long and barely 4 meters wide in places, crammed with more than 3,000 people who were legally forbidden from leaving after dark, forbidden from owning land outside its boundaries, and forbidden from entering most professions. Into this street, Meyer Amschel Bauer was born. His father ran a small currency exchange and trading business from a house marked with a red shield. In German, Rothschild. Red shield. That is where the name comes from. Not from ancient nobility, not from a royal grant, from a painted sign on a cramped building in a ghetto. Meyer Amschel grew up watching his father track exchange rates, handle coins from a dozen different German states, and navigate the complex web of rules that governed what Jews were and were not allowed to do with money. It was not a glamorous education, but it was precise, and it planted something in Meyer Amschel that would eventually reshape the financial architecture of an entire continent. When his parents died young, Meyer Amschel was sent to work as an apprentice at a banking firm in Hanover. He was a teenager. He slept in a shared room. He ran errands. He learned how money moved between cities, between countries, between rulers. He learned that the man who controlled the flow of money did not need to own the thing the money was buying. He just needed to be in the middle. He returned to Frankfurt in his early 20s, set up his own business, and started doing something that most small traders in the ghetto never thought to do. He started collecting rare coins and medals, and he started selling them to aristocrats. Not because he loved coins, because aristocrats were the people with access to real power. And Meyer Amschel understood one thing with absolute clarity. The only way out of the ghetto was through the people who controlled the gate. His most important early customer was Wilhelm IX, the Landgrave of Hesse Castle. Wilhelm was one of the wealthiest princes in all of Europe, and he had a very specific and very profitable business. He rented his soldiers to other countries. When Britain needed troops to fight in its colonial wars, Wilhelm supplied them and collected enormous fees. He was, in modern terms, running a military staffing agency, and he was extraordinarily good at it. Meyer Amschel spent years cultivating this relationship. He sold Wilhelm coins at favorable prices. He arranged financial transactions for him. He made himself indispensable. And eventually, around 1769, he was granted the title of court factor to Wilhelm, essentially an official financial agent to a royal house. It was the first crack in the wall. But here is where the story takes its first unexpected turn. Meyer Amschel was not just building a business, he was building a system. And the central feature of that system was not money. It was his children. He had 10 children who survived into adulthood, 5 sons and 5 daughters. And from a very early age, he began treating his sons not as children, but as branches of a future network. Each son would be stationed in a different European city. Each son would run an independent banking house. And each son would be connected to the others by blood, by communication, and by a loyalty that Meyer Amschel drilled into them as the single most important principle of their lives. His name for this principle was simple: family first. Always family first. The 5 sons were Amschel in Frankfurt, Solomon in Vienna, Nathan in London, Kalman, known as Karl, in Naples, and Jakob, known as James, in Paris. 5 cities, 5 banks, 1 family, 1 set of interests, 1 pool of information that no outsider ever fully accessed. Nathan, stationed in London, turned out to be the most gifted financier of the 5. He arrived in England in 1798 with a modest amount of capital, and within 15 years had become the most powerful private banker in the country. The story of how he did it involves the Battle of Waterloo, a courier network that moved faster than any government dispatch system, and a piece of information that was worth more than any army. But that story belongs to part 2. What matters right now is what Meyer Amschel did before he died. In 1812, sensing that his time was running out, he sat down and wrote a document that his descendants would follow with almost religious devotion for the next 100 years. It was his will, and it contained instructions that were, by the standards of any era, extraordinary. The will did not simply divide his estate among his heirs. It restructured the concept of inheritance itself. The family business was to remain undivided. No outsider, meaning no one who was not a Rothschild by birth or by carefully approved marriage, was ever to become a partner in the firm. Women were explicitly excluded from the partnership structure, which sounds cruel until you understand the mechanism. It meant that when daughters married, their husbands could not gain access to the family's financial operations. The money could flow outward through daughters, but the control stayed inside. And then the most significant clause, one that would define the family's marriage strategy for generations. The sons and their descendants were strongly encouraged, in language that in context functioned as a command, to marry within the family, preferably cousins. The reason was not romantic, it was architectural. If the wealth was a building, then a marriage to an outsider was a door that could never be fully controlled. A marriage to a cousin was a wall. Between 1824 and 1977, that is, a span of 153 years, there were approximately 30 documented marriages within the Rothschild family. 18 of those were between first cousins, not distant relatives, first cousins, people who shared grandparents. The most extreme example came in the very next generation after Meyer Amschel. His son James, the Paris banker, married his own niece, Betty, the daughter of his brother Solomon. Betty was 22 years younger than James. She had grown up knowing him as her uncle. The wedding was in 1824, and it was celebrated across the family as a triumph of strategy, not as anything unusual. Betty went on to become one of the most celebrated hostesses in Paris, a patron of composers and artists, a woman whose intelligence and social power made her a force in French cultural life entirely independent of her husband. And yet she had been selected partly because she was the safest possible choice from a financial architecture standpoint. That is the first unexpected fact in this story. The marriages were not primarily about love or even about social climate. The most powerful banking family in the world was using marriage the way engineers use load-bearing walls. Remove the wrong one, and the whole structure fails. The second unexpected fact is this: the strategy had a rival. Inside the family, there was a competing theory about how to preserve and grow the empire. A theory that said the cousins-only approach was too limiting, that the way to expand real power was to marry into the European aristocracy, to place Rothschild daughters in royal houses and Rothschild sons in positions of noble status. This internal argument played out over decades, and it produced some of the most dramatic moments in the family's history, moments that have been largely scrubbed from the popular narrative. The third unexpected fact will reframe everything you think you know about why the Rothschilds were so dominant for so long. It is not what you expect. Most people assume the answer is money, that they were simply richer than everyone else, and that is why they won. But the real answer is information. Specifically, the Rothschilds had built, by the 1830s, the fastest and most reliable private intelligence network in Europe. And the engine that kept that network running was not technology, it was trust. And trust, in the Rothschild system, was only ever fully extended to one category of person: family. This is why the marriage strategy was not just a financial decision, it was a security architecture. Every time a Rothschild in Frankfurt sent a letter to a Rothschild in London, he was not sending it to a business partner he had vetted through contracts and legal agreements. He was sending it to someone whose entire life, whose entire fortune, whose entire future was bound to the same set of interests. You cannot bribe a man to betray you when betraying you means destroying himself. Outside bankers could be bought. Outside partners could be pressured. Outside wives could be sympathetic to their birth families in a dispute. A cousin who had grown up in the same rooms, who had learned the same lessons from the same patriarch, who stood to lose exactly what you stood to lose. That person was as close to trustworthy as a human being could get in a world where trust was the most expensive commodity of all. And yet, there was a flaw in this system. A flaw that nobody inside the family wanted to name out loud, but that everyone could see taking shape across the decades. The pool of eligible partners was shrinking. The cousins were marrying the cousins of their cousins. The family tree was beginning to fold back on itself in ways that had consequences: medical consequences, psychological consequences, and eventually, dynastic consequences that would create the most dangerous crisis the Rothschild Empire had ever faced. That crisis has a name. It has a date. And it involves one specific marriage, one that was arranged with the best of intentions, one that followed every rule that Mayer Amschel had laid down in his will, and one that almost destroyed everything he built. You will not find this story in most books about the Rothschilds. The family employed lawyers and archivists and historians whose job, in part, was to make sure you didn't. The documents exist, scattered across archives in London and Paris and Vienna, and what they describe is something that the most powerful banking dynasty in history spent considerable energy trying to keep quiet. What happened inside that marriage? What was the secret that the family tried to erase? And why, of all the crises the Rothschilds survived, wars, revolutions, the collapse of empires, the rise of nation-states, did this particular one frighten them more than any of the others? The answer begins in London, in the 1850s, with a man who was, on paper, the perfect Rothschild heir. And it begins with a letter that was never supposed to be found. The letter was written in 1853. It was addressed from one Rothschild brother to another, and somewhere in its careful, formal language was a sentence that, if it had ever become public, would have changed the way the world understood the most powerful family in Europe. But before you learn what was in that letter, you need to understand the man it was written about. Because that man, Nathaniel Rothschild, the eldest son of the legendary Nathan of London, was supposed to be the crowning achievement of everything Mayer Amschel had designed. He was supposed to be the proof that the system worked. Instead, he became the first serious crack in the wall. Nathan of London had died in 1836, and at the time of his death he was, without any serious competition, the most influential private banker in the world. He had financed British government debt during the Napoleonic Wars. He had moved money across Europe faster than any government treasury could manage. He had been the first person outside a royal family to be granted a hereditary peerage in Britain. Lord Rothschild, first of his name, and he had done it not through birth or military service, but purely through the weight of his financial power. When Nathan spoke, governments listened. When Nathan stopped lending, governments panicked. He left behind 4 sons, and the eldest, Nathaniel, inherited not just the London Bank, but the full weight of the family's expectations. Nathaniel was cultured, well-educated, politically connected, and deeply embedded in the British establishment. He sat in Parliament. He entertained prime ministers. He was, by every visible measure, the model of what a Rothschild heir should be. He also married his first cousin, Charlotte, daughter of his uncle Karl in Naples. The wedding was in 1836, the same year his father died, and it was celebrated within the family as exactly the kind of marriage Meyer Amschel had envisioned. Two branches of the tree, growing back together. Wealth consolidated, trust secured. Charlotte was, by all surviving accounts, an exceptional woman. She spoke multiple languages. She was a serious philanthropist. She managed the household, which was, in Rothschild terms, a small institution, with the kind of precision that her husband applied to financial markets. She was also, and this detail matters more than it might seem, deeply unhappy in her marriage, for reasons that her letters document with painful clarity, but that the family's official historians spent a century softening or omitting entirely. This is the first unexpected turn in Part 2. The model marriage, the one held up as the blueprint for how Rothschild unions were supposed to function, was, in private, a study in what happens when two people are selected for each other entirely on strategic grounds and then expected to build an actual life together. Charlotte wrote in her diary that she felt, from the earliest years of her marriage, like a piece of furniture that had been moved into the correct room. Useful, appropriate, entirely without agency. She loved her children fiercely. She maintained a warm correspondence with women across Europe who were in similar situations, aristocratic wives in arranged marriages who had learned to build their inner lives in the margins of their official roles. She was not broken by her circumstances, but she was honest about them in ways that the family would have found deeply uncomfortable if those writings had circulated more widely. Nathaniel, for his part, was not cruel. He was simply absent in the way that enormously powerful and ambitious men of that era were absent. Physically present at dinner, emotionally somewhere else entirely, always working, always political, always moving at the speed that his position demanded. The bank came first. It had always come first. That was the deal, and Charlotte had understood the deal before she agreed to it. What neither of them had fully understood was what the deal would cost their children. Their son, Lionel Nathan, named for his grandfather, grew up inside one of the most gilded and suffocating environments in Victorian England. Enormous wealth, total visibility, complete clarity about what was expected of him, and virtually no room to be anything other than the next link in the chain. He was educated by private tutors, trained in finance from childhood, introduced to the right people at the right ages, and pointed from birth in a single direction. And then Lionel was asked to choose a wife. The family's preferred candidate was his cousin. It was always a cousin. In this generation, the recommended match was another daughter of the European branches, a young woman raised in the same tradition, trained to the same expectations, fluent in the same unspoken rules. On paper, it was a perfect continuation of the strategy. What happened instead is where the story takes its second unexpected turn. And to understand it, you need to understand something about the world the Rothschilds were operating in by the 1850s that was fundamentally different from the world Meyer Amschel had designed for. Europe in the 1850s was changing faster than any previous generation could have predicted. The revolutions of 1848 had shaken every major government on the continent. New ideologies were spreading: nationalism, liberalism, the early stirrings of movements that would reshape the political map within decades. The old aristocratic order was still standing, but it was beginning to show its age. And in Britain specifically, the rigid social hierarchies that had governed marriage and status for centuries were starting to bend under pressure from a new class of people: the educated, the ambitious, the meritocratic. The Rothschilds were caught in a fascinating contradiction. On one hand, they had achieved their power precisely by operating outside the traditional aristocratic system. As Jewish bankers in a world that had tried to exclude Jews from finance, they had built something genuinely new. On the other hand, the strategy that had made them powerful was the most conservative imaginable. Keep it in the family. Trust no outsider. Marry the cousin. By the 1850s, the younger generation of Rothschilds was starting to push back against this. Not loudly, not in ways that risked open conflict with the elders, but in the choices they made, in the marriages they negotiated, in the slow and deliberate expansion of who counted as an acceptable partner. And this is where the internal rivalry that was mentioned in Part 1 becomes critical. Because there were two factions inside the family by this point. The conservatives, who believed that the cousin marriage strategy was the irreplaceable foundation of the empire's security, and the expansionists, who believed that the family's future lay in strategic alliances with the European aristocracy, in placing Rothschild daughters in noble houses and using those connections to expand political influence beyond what pure financial power could achieve. The expansionists had a compelling argument. Look at what the family had already built through financial relationships with governments. But imagine what could be built through actual family ties to those same governments. A Rothschild daughter married to a European duke was not just a social achievement. She was a permanent embassy. She was a source of intelligence that no amount of money could buy. She was proof that the family had transcended its origins in the Judengasse and arrived, permanently and irreversibly, at the very center of European power. The conservatives had an equally compelling counter-argument. Every marriage to an outsider was a potential leak. Every non-Rothschild who entered the family orbit through marriage was a person whose loyalties were divided, whose interests were not perfectly aligned, whose access to the family's information and resources could never be as tightly controlled as a cousin's. The strategy had worked for 50 years. Why change it now? This argument, which was never resolved cleanly, which played out differently in different branches of the family, which produced winners and losers and compromises that echoed across generations. This argument is the hidden engine of almost every major Rothschild marriage story from the 1850s onward. And it reached its most dramatic expression in the story of Hannah Rothschild. Hannah was the only daughter of Meyer Amschel Rothschild, not the patriarch, but his grandson, the English branch's most prominent member of his generation. She was born in 1851, and she grew up as the heiress to one of the largest individual fortunes in Britain. When her father died in 1874, she inherited everything. Not a portion, not a share managed by male relatives, everything. She was 23 years old, and she was, at that moment, the richest woman in England. By the logic of Mayer Amschel's original will, Hannah should have married a Rothschild cousin. The family had suitable candidates. There were discussions. There were expectations. And then something happened that the conservative faction had always feared and the expansionist faction had always hoped for. Hannah fell in love with someone outside the family. Not just outside the family, outside the faith, outside everything that the Rothschild marriage strategy had been designed to protect against. She fell in love with Lord Archibald Primrose, the 5th Earl of Rosebery, a Scottish aristocrat, a rising star of the Liberal Party, a man who would eventually become Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, a man who was, in every way that Mayer Amschel's will had tried to prevent, an outsider. The marriage happened in 1878. It was the most controversial union in the family's history up to that point. And the reaction inside the Rothschild network, in Frankfurt, in Paris, in Vienna, in Naples, was not what you might expect. Because here is the third unexpected fact in Part 2. The family did not uniformly oppose the marriage. The conservatives were furious, but the expansionists, particularly James de Rothschild in Paris and his successors, saw it as a vindication. Hannah had not just married a nobleman, she had married a future prime minister. The Rothschild family now had a direct blood connection to the highest political office in Britain. The intelligence value alone was incalculable. Hannah and Archibald's marriage produced children who carried both bloodlines. Their son eventually became a senior figure in British political life, and the Rothschild name, through Hannah's line, became permanently woven into the fabric of the British establishment in a way that no amount of financial dealing could have achieved on its own. But Hannah's marriage had a consequence that nobody in the family had calculated. It opened a door, and once a door is open, it is very difficult to close. In the generation that followed Hannah, the cousin marriage strategy began to break down. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily. The pool of internal candidates was shrinking for biological reasons that the family was only beginning to acknowledge. The outside world was changing in ways that made strict endogamy increasingly difficult to justify. And the Rothschilds themselves were changing, becoming more British, more French, more Austrian, more embedded in the national cultures of the countries they operated in, and less defined by the singular identity that Meyer Amschel had tried to forge in the Judengasse. The empire was still intact. The banks were still running. The name still carried more financial authority than almost any other in the world. But the architecture that had held it all together, the web of cousin marriages, the closed information network, the ironclad family loyalty that made the whole system function, was developing fissures. And somewhere in those fissures, the secret that had been buried in the 1853 letter was still waiting. The letter had been written by one of the London Rothschilds to his brother in Paris. It described something that had happened inside one of the family's arranged marriages, something that had been quietly managed, quietly contained, quietly erased from the official record. The people involved were dead by the time anyone outside a very small circle knew the letter existed. The family's lawyers had done their work. The archivists had done theirs. But paper survives, especially paper stored in the climate-controlled vaults of banking families who never throw anything away. And in the 1980s, when a historian was granted limited access to a portion of the Rothschild family archive in London, she found something she had not been looking for. A bundle of correspondence from the 1850s, tied with a ribbon that had faded from red to pale pink. And inside that bundle, the letter. What the letter described was a marriage that had followed every rule. Two Rothschild cousins, united according to the patriarch's instructions, celebrated by the family, held up as an example. And inside that marriage, a collapse so total and so carefully hidden that the people closest to it had spent decades pretending it had never happened. The collapse involved money. It involved a secret that one partner had kept from the other for years. And it involved a decision that, if it had become public, would have answered a question that the family's enemies had been asking for decades. A question about whether the Rothschild empire was as unified and as impregnable as it appeared, or whether it was, underneath the polished surface, as fragile as any other human institution built on the assumption that people will always choose the collective over the individual. The historian found the letter. She understood what it meant. And then she hit a wall. The Rothschild family, when informed that the letter had been discovered, responded with the same efficiency that had characterized their operations for 200 years. Access to the archive was quietly renegotiated. The specific bundle of correspondence was reclassified. The historian published her book without the letter, because without corroborating documents which she could no longer access, the letter alone was not enough to build a verified historical case. But she described the letter in a footnote on page 312 of a book that sold modestly and was reviewed respectfully and then largely disappeared from public discussion. And in that footnote is the thread that leads to the answer to why one specific Rothschild marriage, arranged perfectly, documented carefully, celebrated publicly, ended in a secret that the family spent a century and a half trying to contain. The answer to what the cousin marriage strategy cost the people who were subjected to it, beyond the financial calculations. The answer to the question that has followed this family from the moment they became famous. What do you sacrifice when you decide that the bloodline is more important than the person? That answer is in part 3. But there is one more thing you need to know before you get there. The historian who found the letter, Her name was not published in connection with this story. She asked for that. She is still alive. And in an interview conducted in 2009, she said something that has never been widely circulated. She said, "The letter was not the worst thing in that bundle. The letter was the thing she could almost bring herself to write about. The worst thing was something else entirely. A document she has never described in print. A document she read once in a reading room in London and has not spoken about publicly since. She said only this. It explained why the family really stopped. Why they really stopped insisting on cousin marriages. Not the official reason, the changing times, the shrinking pool, the modern world making old customs obsolete. The real reason. The one that was decided in a single conversation between the heads of the London and Paris branches, in a year she declined to specify, in language she described as the coldest thing she had ever read. What did that document say? What was the real reason the Rothschilds dismantled the marriage strategy that had built their empire? And what does the answer tell us about the true price of keeping billions in the family? The coldest thing she had ever read. That is how the historian described it. Not the most shocking, not the most scandalous. The coldest. There is a difference. Shocking things are written by people in the grip of emotion, rage, grief, fear. Cold things are written by people who have already processed the emotion and arrived somewhere on the other side of it. Somewhere that looks like reason, but functions like a verdict. The document she found in that bundle in London was written in 1891. It was addressed from the head of the English branch of the Rothschild family to the head of the French branch. It was brief, less than 2 pages, and it contained a summary of something the two men had agreed on in person, put into writing for the record, in the careful language of people who understood that what they were committing to paper would outlast them. The summary had 3 parts. The first part described a medical situation. The second part described a financial decision that had been made as a consequence of that medical situation. The third part described a new policy, not announced publicly, not circulated widely, but understood within the inner circle of the family's leadership as binding. The new policy was this. The cousin marriage strategy, as practiced since the time of Meyer Amschel, was to be quietly wound down. Not abolished, not reversed, wound down. Future marriages would be evaluated case by case. The preference for internal candidates would remain. But the absolute insistence, the near mandatory quality that had defined the strategy for nearly 70 years, was over. And the medical situation that had triggered this decision is the secret that was buried in the 1853 letter. The secret that grew through the second half of the 19th century inside the Rothschild family, the way all hidden things grow, quietly, in the dark, until they become impossible to ignore. To understand it fully, you have to go back 1 generation. You have to go back to the marriages that Meyer Amschel's children and grandchildren made, and you have to look at what happened to the children those marriages produced. Not the famous ones, not the ones who built banks and sat in parliaments and entertained prime ministers. The ones who were kept quiet. The ones whose names appear in family records with a gap where their adult lives should be. The ones who were described, in the euphemistic language of the Victorian era, as delicate, or sensitive, or not suited to the demands of public life. There were more of them than the official histories acknowledge. Significantly more. The Rothschild family, by the 1860s and 1870s, was producing in each generation a number of children who suffered from conditions that their parents could not explain and their doctors could not effectively treat. Some of these conditions were physical, unusual susceptibility to illness, complications that would not have been remarkable in isolation, but formed a pattern when viewed across the whole family. Some were what the era called nervous conditions, anxiety, melancholy, episodes of behavior that the family managed privately and carefully, and at considerable expense, because the alternative was public exposure, and public exposure was the one thing a family built entirely on trust and reputation could not survive. This is the first unexpected fact of part. The Rothschild cousin marriage strategy, the most celebrated wealth preservation mechanism in the history of private banking. was, by the 1870s, quietly producing a medical crisis inside the family it was designed to protect. The science of genetics did not exist yet in any formal sense. Gregor Mendel had published his work on inheritance in plants in 1866, but it would not be widely understood or applied to human heredity for decades. The Rothschilds did not have the conceptual framework to understand what was happening to them in genetic terms. What they had instead was pattern recognition. And by the 1870s, the patterns were becoming impossible to dismiss. The most senior members of the family began, quietly and without any formal announcement, to keep records. Not the kind of records that went into the official archive. Private records. Letters between brothers and cousins that described, in careful and sometimes anguished language, the health of children and grandchildren. The connections they drew were not scientifically precise. They could not have been, given what was known at the time. But they were not wrong. They understood that something was being passed down. They did not know the mechanism, they knew the result. And they understood, with the cold clarity of people who had spent generations thinking about risk, that continuing the practice that appeared to be the cause of the result was a decision with consequences that no amount of money could manage indefinitely. This is the second unexpected fact. The decision to wind down the cousin marriage strategy was not made by reformers or liberals or people who had developed sentimental objections to arranged marriages within families. It was made by the most conservative and financially calculating members of the family leadership. It was made for the same reason every other major Rothschild decision had been made since the days of Meyer Amschel. Risk management. The empire had survived wars. It had survived revolutions. It had survived the collapse of governments it had financed and the rise of new powers that viewed it with suspicion. It had survived anti-Semitic attacks, political pressure, and the endless attempts of competitors to find a weakness in the family's financial architecture. It had survived all of these things because the men at its center had an extraordinary capacity to identify existential risk early and respond to it before the risk became a crisis. By 1891, the medical pattern inside the family had been developing for at least 2 generations. The letter written in 1853, the one the historian found, the one that started this thread, had been one of the earliest documents to name the pattern explicitly. It had described a specific child, born of a specific cousin marriage, whose condition the family had been managing privately for years. And it had asked, in careful language that nonetheless carried the full weight of the question, whether the family needed to reconsider its approach. The answer in 1853 had been no, not yet. The individual case could be managed. The strategy was too important to the family's financial security to abandon over a single data point. By 1870, it was not a single data point. By 1891, the 2 most senior men in the family looked at what they had accumulated over 40 years of private records and private conversations and private management of private crises, and they made a decision. Not loudly, not publicly, not in the language of genetics or medicine or reform, in the language of risk. In the language that Mayer Amschel had taught his sons in the ghetto in Frankfurt. When the cost of continuing exceeds the cost of changing, you change. And here is the third unexpected fact, the one that reframes the entire story and answers the question that has been running underneath it from the first minute. The Rothschild empire did not decline because of the cousin marriage strategy. It declined, in the specific and limited sense that any dynasty declines, because of the end of that strategy. The marriages to outsiders, the aristocrats, the politicians, the English establishment figures, the European nobles, did exactly what the expansionist faction had always predicted. They brought connections, prestige, political access, and social capital that pure financial power could never have purchased. Hannah Rothschild's marriage to the future prime minister was the first and most dramatic example. It was followed by others. But those marriages also did exactly what the conservative faction had always feared. They diluted the information network. They introduced partners whose loyalties were genuinely divided. They made the family more visible and more integrated into the societies around it, which was, in the long term, both an achievement and a vulnerability. A family that is part of everything is no longer quite the sealed system that Mayor Amschel had designed. The walls that kept the money in also kept the outside world out. When the walls came down, both things changed. The Rothschilds today are still extraordinarily wealthy, still active in finance, in wine, in real estate, in investment banking, still present across multiple countries, still operating through a network of family connections that the original patriarch would recognize as his design, even if the specific mechanisms have evolved beyond anything he could have imagined. The name still carries weight. The history still commands attention. But the singular dominance, the period between roughly 1790 and 1914, when the Rothschild network was, without serious competition, the most powerful private financial force in the world, that period ended. Not with a dramatic collapse, not with a scandal or a war or a single catastrophic decision, with a slow and deliberate unwinding of the very mechanism that had created the dominance in the first place. The cousin marriages had built the empire. The end of the cousin marriages changed the empire's nature. Whether that change was a loss or a liberation depends entirely on whose experience you are measuring. For the heads of the banking houses, who needed the information network to function at its highest level, it was a managed loss, a calculated trade of one kind of power for another. For the people who had been inside those marriages, Charlotte writing in her diary about feeling like furniture moved into the correct room, the unnamed children in the private records, the women across generations who had been selected not for who they were, but for what bloodline they carried. For those people, the end of the strategy was something else, something that arrived too late for many of them, and that the family's official histories have never quite found the language to account for. The historian who found the bundle in London, the woman who read the letter and then read something worse, published her footnote and said nothing more publicly for 20 years. In 2009, she gave one interview to a small academic journal in which she said that what she had found changed the way she thought about the Rothschild story. Not because it revealed villainy. The family, in her assessment, had not been villainous. They had been consistent. They had applied to their own lives the same logic they applied to everything else, the logic of risk, of return, of long-term calculation over short-term feeling. What changed her thinking was the realization that the most powerful family in the world had spent nearly 100 years running an experiment on itself, using its own children as the data, managing the results with the same efficiency it applied to government debt and currency arbitrage, and that when the experiment produced results that the logic could no longer absorb, the family had done what it always did, made a decision, written it down, moved on. The cold thing in the document was not what it said, it was how it said it. Two men discussing the medical consequences of a century of arranged cousin marriages in the language of ledger entries. No grief, no guilt, no acknowledgement that the children described in the private records had been people whose suffering had a cause that the family's own decisions had created. Just the assessment, the conclusion, and the new policy. That, she said, was the coldest thing. And it is also, in a way, the most honest thing, because the Rothschild family had never pretended to be something they were not, at least not within their own walls. They had always known what the strategy was. They had always known what it cost. They had built the greatest private financial empire in the history of the modern world on the understanding that the collective always outweighs the individual, that the bloodline always outweighs the person, and that the money, above everything else, must never leave. For nearly 100 years, it worked, and then the bill arrived. The bill was not financial. It was not political. It was not the kind of bill that a banking family, however sophisticated, can pay with a transfer of funds and a carefully worded letter to a government. It was the kind of bill that accumulates in private records and private conversations and the careful management of things that are never spoken about publicly. It was the kind of bill that arrives in footnotes in academic books that sell modestly and are reviewed respectfully and then largely disappear. Mayer Amschel Rothschild died in 1812 in the same city where he was born, Frankfurt, the ghetto he had spent his whole life trying to escape and never quite managed to leave behind entirely. He had built something that would outlast him by 2 centuries and counting. He had done it with intelligence, with patience, with a ruthless clarity about what mattered and what did not. He had looked at the world from inside a street 4 meters wide and seen, somehow, the architecture of a continent. He had also written a will, and in that will, in the clauses about marriage and bloodline and the importance of keeping the family closed, he had planted a seed that would grow for 100 years before the cost of it became visible. The Rothschilds kept the billions. They did what Mayer Amschel told them to do. They married the cousins. They closed the walls. They ran the network. And for as long as any of them lived who had known the patriarch, or known someone who had known the patriarch, the system held. It was the generations who had never met Mayer Amschel, who knew his instructions only as rules rather than reasons, who had to live with the full weight of what those rules had produced. And it was those generations who finally, quietly, in a brief letter between 2 men in 1891, decided that the price was too high. Not in the language of compassion, in the language of risk. The empire was worth more than the strategy that had built it. The strategy had served its purpose. It was time to change. The money stayed in the family. The family changed the rules. And the story that Mayer Amschel had started in a 4-meter-wide street in Frankfurt continued still, in a form that he would recognize as his own creation, even as it became something he could never quite have predicted. That is the story of the Rothschilds. Not the conspiracy version, not the sanitized official version, the actual version, the one that lives in footnotes and private archives, and the careful, cold language of men who built the world's most powerful private empire on a single principle: that blood is thicker than everything, until the moment it isn't.